The sun had barely cleared the horizon when Margaret Maggie Collins pulled her old, dusty Ford Ranger through the east gate of Camp Greystone, a military installation nestled deep in the New Mexico desert. At 6:47 a.m., the air already carried that familiar blend of diesel exhaust and sun-baked gravel, the kind of smell that never quite leaves a soldier's memory. Maggie sat for a moment behind the wheel, hands steady on the sun-worn steering wheel. She was 46 now, the brown in her hair softened with streaks of silver, pulled back in the same no-nonsense bun she'd worn since boot camp. Her eyes were older, sharper maybe, but carried the same unwavering calm they always had, whether behind a desk or behind a trigger. She wasn't here to relive old glories. She wasn't here for attention. She was here because Command Sergeant Major Ray Dean, an old comrade in arms, had called 3 weeks prior with a simple request. "We've got a fresh batch of female recruits," he'd said, his voice like gravel and coffee. "They need someone who knows what it means to finish strong, especially when everything around you's falling apart." Maggie didn't even let him finish the sentence. She'd said yes. She stepped out of the truck in her faded army gray T-shirt and black PT shorts, dog tags still resting on her chest. Tags she'd never once taken off in over 2 decades of service. There was no rank on her shirt, no stitched name tape. Just her and her duffel bag slung over one shoulder. Quiet, simple, intentional. She approached the administration building, where the hum of fluorescent lights met the chilled sting of overworked air conditioning. Inside, the reception area was lined with outdated safety posters, a stale pot of government coffee steaming in the corner. Behind the desk sat a young Army specialist named Josh Mercer, probably no older than 24, with a face too smooth for combat and the kind of confidence that only comes from never having your boots dirty outside the wire. He looked up and blinked at her uniform. "Mom, I'm sorry. Base policy says only active duty personnel can wear PT gear like that," he said, glancing at her T-shirt with discomfort. "You'll need to either change or leave the premises." From the corner, a middle-aged civilian worker muttered without lowering her voice, "Can't have people playing dress up. You're either in or you're out." Maggie didn't argue. She didn't flinch. She just stood still, calm, quiet, as if time were hers to command. Lieutenant Colin Harwood appeared next. Early 30s, perfect creases, mirror-polished boots. The kind of man who led PowerPoint briefings with the same enthusiasm others reserved for combat. He reviewed her paperwork, frowned at the lack of active duty status, and offered her a base, issued Navy T-shirt in plastic wrap. "You're welcome to support training," he said smoothly, but only in approved civilian attire. Maggie looked at the shirt, then at him. She didn't speak. She didn't protest. She just reached down for her duffel bag, shoulders still squared, movement still deliberate. And that's when it happened. As she bent forward, the hem of her shirt lifted slightly, revealing a portion of her upper back, just enough to show the sharp, faded ink 1375 etched in black, precise and angular like it had been burned in. Beneath it, barely visible, was a stylized owl perched on 2 crossed swords. Most in the room didn't notice, but someone did. Staff Sergeant Raul Hernandez, walking past with a maintenance clipboard, caught a glimpse and froze. The clipboard slipped from his hand, clattering to the tile floor. He'd seen that tattoo before. Not in magazines, not online, but in briefings that had been shredded after reading. Detachment 1375, the Night Owl Unit. The ghosts who held the Northern Pass alone during the NATO convoy collapse in 2000. The unit that had no medals, no ceremonies, because their existence was classified. Raul's face went pale. His breath hitched. He turned fast, walking toward the comms room. There was a number in his memory, burned in from a briefing he was told to forget, and he was about to use it. Outside, Maggie settled on a bench near the track, watching the young recruits stretching and checking their laces. She didn't sulk. She didn't fume. She just waited. She didn't come to prove anything. She came because someone needed her, because she remembered what it was like to be 19 and terrified and not yet sure what strength looked like. The sun rose higher. The breeze tugged gently at her shirt, and the numbers on her back remained, unspoken, but no longer unseen. Inside the admin building of Camp Greystone, the air was dry and cold. Standard issue government HVA. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a pale glow on beige walls lined with bulletin boards and faded motivational posters. Maggie Collins stepped forward with quiet confidence, placing her authorization papers on the desk with the same deliberate precision she once used to clear a rifle. The young specialist behind the counter, Private Josh Mercer, blinked at the documents like they were written in code. "Just a second, ma'am," he muttered, fingers tapping at his keyboard with half-interest. "You said you're here for the physical assessment support team." She nodded once. "Volunteer roster. Sergeant Major Dean cleared it last week, right?" Mercer replied, narrowing his eyes at the screen. "I've got a Mem Collins listed, but—" He paused, glancing at her PT shirt, then back to the screen. "Mem, base policy says retired personnel can't wear the uniform unless it's for a ceremony or special event." Maggie's expression didn't change. Her dog tags rested just under her collar, the edges of the steel chain glinting against skin worn by sun and time. "This isn't about uniform code," she said quietly. "It's about setting pace for new recruits." But Mercer wasn't listening anymore. He turned toward the side office, speaking over his shoulder. "Lieutenant Harwood, could I get a quick policy check over here?" A moment later, Lieutenant Colin Harwood emerged, every inch the picture of regulation. Early 30s, bronze hair neatly parted. His uniform looked like it came straight from the mannequin at the PX. There was confidence in his step, but it wasn't the kind built in the field. It was the kind taught in air-conditioned classrooms and reinforced by protocol. "I understand we have a bit of a situation," he said with a courteous smile, extending a hand. "Ms. Collins, I'm Lieutenant Harwood. Can I take a look at your paperwork?" She handed it to him silently. He skimmed the authorization with a mechanical thoroughness. His jaw tightened slightly as he found what he was looking for, a line that didn't explicitly use the word order. "This is a recommendation from Command Sergeant Major Dean. It's not an official assignment, which means uniform regulations still apply." Then, with the air of someone solving a minor but irritating issue, he added, "We've got a spare shirt for you here, navy blue, base logo. Civilian safe." Private Mercer produced it in a plastic bag and placed it neatly on the counter. Harwood gestured to it with the kind of polite finality that left no room for further discussion. "If you'd like to proceed, you're welcome to join the training. Just not in the PT uniform." Behind them, two civilian staffers, contracted clerks sorting files and sipping stale coffee, glanced over at the exchange. "Oh boy," one of them muttered, not even bothering to keep his voice down. Another vet stuck in the past. "Playing soldier on a Wednesday morning." His coworker chuckled. "You'd think after 20 years, they'd get tired of trying to relive the glory days." Maggie heard it all, every word, but she didn't react. She just stood there, calm, silent, immovable, a presence more than a person, a stillness that came from knowing exactly who she was and no longer needing to explain it to anyone. Harwood mistook the silence for acquiescence. "We appreciate your service, ma'am. Truly, but the policy exists for a reason." That was when Maggie moved. Not abruptly, just enough to reach for her duffel, resting by her feet. And as she bent slightly, the hem of her worn gray shirt lifted. It was just a glimpse, barely a flash of ink beneath the collar line. But it was enough, 3 numbers, bold, black, unmistakable 1375, and beneath them, an insignia no one was ever meant to see in public, and all with wings outstretched, perched above 2 crossed swords. Simple, sharp, silent. Lieutenant Harwood didn't notice. Private Mercer had already turned back to his terminal. The clerks kept laughing. But down the hall, Staff Sergeant Raul Hernandez, clipboard in hand, stopped mid-step. His eyes widened. His grip slackened. The clipboard slipped from his fingers and landed on the tile with a slap that echoed louder than it should have. He knew that tattoo. He'd seen it once in a top-secret intelligence briefing long before his promotion. A shadow mission. A fallback line held under impossible fire. NATO convoy saved. 43 minutes with no reinforcements, no backup. Just 1 unit, Detachment 1375. The Night Owls. Officially, they never existed. Unofficially, they saved 24 lives and stopped a catastrophe. And now one of them stood 10 feet away, being told to change shirts or leave the building. Raul swallowed hard, his heart pounded. His instincts screamed at him to act, but protocol held him still. Maggie hoisted the duffel over her shoulder, calm as ever, and turned toward the door without a word. She wasn't offended. She wasn't surprised, because she'd lived long enough to know, when the uniform fades, the silence begins. And it's in that silence that you learn who actually sees you and who only sees the shirt. She didn't say a word. Not when the lieutenant handed her that bagged up navy shirt like it was a bandage for a wound they couldn't see. Not when the civilian staff muttered their judgments and chuckled like they were passing time in a grocery line. And not when she hoisted her duffel back over her shoulder and turned toward the exit. But fate has a strange way of correcting what protocol misses. As Maggie Collins bent forward, calm, composed, ready to walk out as quietly as she had come, the back of her shirt pulled up just an inch too far. It was unintentional, unremarkable to anyone who wasn't looking. But someone was. Down the hallway, Staff Sergeant Raul Hernandez, clipboard tucked under one arm, had just come from the motor pool to drop off a maintenance report. He wasn't supposed to be there. He wasn't supposed to look. But something, call it instinct, had turned his head at just the right moment. What he saw made his legs freeze where they stood. There, across Maggie's sun-worn back, inked in faded but unmistakable black 1375. 3 numbers, no frills, no decoration, just above them a weathered emblem, an owl with its wings outstretched, perched above 2 crossed swords, small, precise, and for those who knew, unforgettable. Raul's breath caught. The clipboard slipped from his grasp and hit the linoleum with a sharp clap. He didn't move, didn't blink. His gaze was locked on that ink like it had reached across 2 decades and grabbed him by the collar. He knew that number. He knew that owl. They weren't just symbols. They were ghosts. Long ago, as a junior intel analyst stationed in Ramstein, Germany, Raul had been assigned to comb through redacted field reports, after-action summaries, blacked-out transcripts, satellite logs that were never archived. Most were routine. But every now and then, something slipped through that changed the air in the room. Detachment 1375 Night Owl Group. Unofficial, off-record, and unforgettable. They weren't just black ops. They were the fallback. When the northern gate of the NATO corridor in Afghanistan had collapsed in April 2000, and every unit within reach had either pulled back or been overrun, Detachment 1375 had held the line. 43 minutes, no reinforcements, no air cover. Just them. They saved a NATO convoy of 17 personnel, including 2 diplomats and a classified payload. And then they disappeared. No media, no medals, no official mention, only ink, only whispers. Raul had seen that tattoo once before. In a photo he was told to shred after viewing. A body camera still, grainy, fake but unmistakable. He looked at Maggie now, calm, walking away. Unaware of the silence she'd just carved into the room, and realized she wasn't just someone who had served. She was someone who had saved. His hands trembled. He turned abruptly and walked fast down the corridor, past desks and file cabinets, ignoring the looks. Inside the communications office, he shut the door behind him, heart pounding. There was a number, a secure line from a briefing that no longer officially existed. He wasn't supposed to use it. But if he didn't, he knew he'd regret it for the rest of his life. He dialed. 2 rings. A clipped voice answered. No name, no greeting. Just the sound of someone waiting to hear something important. Command liaison. Raul swallowed. This is Staff Sergeant Raul Hernandez, stationed at Camp Greystone. I believe I've identified an individual with prior attachment to Detachment 1375. The line went silent for a heartbeat, then 2. In the background, Raul could hear the faint clicking of keys. Someone was already searching, verifying. Go ahead, Sergeant. This line is secure. She's here as a volunteer. Name's Margaret Collins. Retired. Female. Has the tattoo, numerals 1375, all in swords emblem. Clear as day. It's not decorative. It's the exact pattern from those briefings. I'm positive. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was loaded. Somewhere, someone far above Raul's pay grade was weighing options, checking files, connecting dots he wasn't cleared to see. Are you certain of the identification? The voice finally asked. Yes, sir, Raul replied, his throat dry. I've seen the markings in classified material. She's not a poser. She's the real thing. A long pause. Then, Sergeant Hernandez, you will inform your commanding officer immediately. That individual is to be treated with full courtesy, and extended any and all support she requests. This directive comes from a level you don't need to know. Rawl felt the blood drain from his face. Yes, sir. Understood? And Sergeant? Yes, this conversation never happened. But if anyone disrespects that woman again, the voice shifted, less military now, more personal. They'll answer to people who don't wear name tapes. Then the line went dead. Rawl slowly lowered the handset, staring at it like it might catch fire. Outside, the world kept turning. But in that moment, deep within Camp Greystone, the winds had shifted. Someone who wasn't supposed to exist had just been seen. And for the first time in years, someone finally remembered. 10 minutes after Staff Sergeant Hernandez hung up that secure phone, Major James Ronson came through the admin building doors like a man with a fire at his back. He was Camp Greystone's senior training officer, mid-50s, weathered by years in the field, his boots worn, not polished for show. The kind of man who didn't have to raise his voice to get a room's attention. He carried himself like someone who had seen real combat and had no patience for people who hadn't. He stopped cold at the front desk, eyes narrowing on Lieutenant Harwood, who was still sifting through volunteer files with the satisfied air of a man convinced he'd done everything by the book. "Lieutenant," Ronson said, voice like dry gravel. Harwood straightened. "Yes, sir. We had an issue this morning with volunteer authorization, I'm told." Harwood nodded confidently. "Yes, sir. A retired NCO showed up in unauthorized PT gear. I enforced regulation AR 671. She didn't have proper orders. I offered a substitute shirt and advised her to leave the installation if she wouldn't comply." Ronson reached into the front pocket of his jacket and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. He smoothed it flat on the counter, letting the header speak first. "CRV verifiation Sergeant First Class Margaret Collins, SBCIL CRNC FAR TRANG SOSPPOR ACT EVEDIS." Ronson tapped the page once. "This was sent to your inbox last Tuesday. Cleared. Signed by the regional command. Why wasn't it processed?" Harwood blinked. "I must have missed it, sir. There's been a lot of paperwork. I didn't realize." "You didn't read your own briefings," Ronson interrupted quietly, but the words hit like a hammer. "Which means you questioned the presence of a decorated combat veteran in public. Based on what?" "Your interpretation of a policy memo." Harwood swallowed. The color drained slowly from his face. Through the front windows, the late morning sun lit up the track where recruits were running drills. Out on the bleachers sat Maggie Collins, right where she'd been the entire time. Duffel at her feet, posture straight, watching a younger generation go through the same motions she'd done decades earlier. Ronson's voice lowered. "Do you know who she is?" Harwood hesitated. "A volunteer. Retired NCO." "That's all I know." "No, Lieutenant, that's not all," Ronson said. "She held the Northern Gate for 43 minutes in April 2000. You ever heard of Detachment 1375? Harwood shook his head slowly. "You're not supposed to," Ronson said. "Most people haven't. The whole unit was blacked out, sealed away. But they saved a NATO convoy that day. I know because I've seen the files. Not redacted copies, the real ones." Then Ronson stepped back from the counter. "You're going to stay right here. And you're going to watch carefully. Because something's about to happen that doesn't get taught in leadership seminars." He turned and walked toward the exit. Out on the track, the air shimmered with late morning heat. A group of recruits had finished their sprints and were hydrating, their youthful chatter drifting across the base. From the far side of the parade ground, the base commander emerged, Colonel Henry Ford, tall, broad-shouldered, salt and pepper hair cropped close. He walked with the kind of calm purpose that came from making decisions no one else wanted to make. His chest was decorated, but nothing about his demeanor was ceremonial. He wasn't here to inspect. He was here to bear witness. Maggie saw him coming from 50 yards out, but she didn't rise. She just looked up, eyes steady, chin high, as if she already knew exactly why he was there. Ford stopped 6 feet in front of her, hands behind his back. The entire track fell quiet. Even the recruits could sense something was different. The ones nearest the bleachers slowed their movement, watching silently. Ford didn't speak right away. When he did, his voice was low, firm, but just loud enough to carry. "That tattoo," he said, nodding toward the ink partially visible across her back. "Where'd you earn it?" Maggie didn't hesitate. "Northern Gate," she replied. "April 2000. Rear fire team." We held the fallback rote. Ford's jaw tightened. For a heartbeat, something flickered in his eyes. Pain, maybe. Gratitude long held. "My brother?" he said quietly. "Private First Class Nathan Ford. He was convoy security that day. You pulled him out after the second IED. You stayed behind so he could move." Maggie looked down for the first time. Her jaw shifted slightly, as if she were steadying herself against the weight of old memories. "I didn't know his name," she said softly. "Didn't matter at the time." Ford took one step closer. "He made it home," he said. "Got married, had 2 kids, retired in 16, died peacefully in his sleep this past winter. He always said a ghost saved him that day." Maggie's eyes flickered, just briefly. Then she nodded. "Good," she whispered. "That's good." And then, without ceremony, without hesitation, Colonel Ford raised his hand in a sharp, formal salute, right there in front of everyone. Every recruit, every officer, every civilian clerk still peeking through the glass. It was the kind of salute that didn't come with a citation. It came with history. It came with meaning. It came with respect. He held it for a second longer than regulation required. Then let it fall. "If Sergeant Collins chooses to wear that uniform," he said, voice cutting clean across the parade ground, "then that's exactly what she'll wear. And if she chooses to train here, she trains here. And if anyone has a problem with that," he turned his gaze directly toward the admin building, "they can explain it to me. Personally." No one said a word, because sometimes the sharpest salute doesn't come with a ceremony. It comes when someone finally remembers who was left behind and chooses to honor them anyway. The salute lingered in the air long after Colonel Ford had lowered his hand. Around the track, no one moved. Recruits stood frozen mid-stretch. Junior officers shifted uneasily. Even the civilian staff watching through the glass didn't dare speak. Respect doesn't need an announcement. It declares itself in silence. Ford took a step closer, his voice lowering again. "If you'll walk with me, Sergeant," he said, this time with something quieter in his tone. Not command, not ceremony. Just sincerity. "I'd like to make this right." Maggie rose slowly, every movement precise, like muscle memory older than her gray streaks. She didn't ask where they were going. She didn't need to. They walked together across the parade ground, not as officer and enlisted, not as past and present, but as soldiers, as peers. Inside the admin building, the chatter evaporated the moment the door opened. Lieutenant Harwood, still behind the desk, looked like he'd aged 10 years in 10 minutes. He straightened his posture reflexively, but even he knew the chain of command had shifted. Colonel Ford didn't break stride. He led Maggie down a quiet corridor, then into his office. Blinds drawn, door shut behind them. A moment of peace in a building full of whispers. Behind his desk, Ford opened a secured laptop. His fingers moved with practiced speed. Pages of classified files scrolled past on the screen. Records few people were cleared to view. "I never forgot Northern Gate," he said, eyes fixed on the screen. "I remember the silence afterward, how the reports vanished. Even the medals got buried." Maggie said nothing. She just sat, hands folded in her lap, steady, still. Ford clicked once more, then turned the monitor toward her. "You were awarded the Bronze Star," he said quietly. "It's still sitting in a file 3 people in the Pentagon have clearance to access." Maggie didn't look at the screen. "Don't need a medal," she replied. "The ones that mattered made it home. That's enough." Ford nodded slowly. Then he reached for a blank form, pulled a pen from his jacket, and began writing. His handwriting was clean, no hesitation. At the bottom, he added his signature and an authorization code, one that opened doors most people never saw. When he finished, he slid the paper across the desk. "Special clearance," he said. "Effective immediately. You are authorized to participate in all Camp Greystone training activities, and you may wear any uniform component you deem appropriate. No restrictions." Maggie glanced at the paper. One look was enough. She folded it once, neatly, deliberately, and tucked it into her duffel bag. "I appreciate it," she said, her voice soft but steady. They left the office side by side. As they passed the same clerks who had laughed hours earlier, no one made eye contact. One stood. Another pretended to find urgent business elsewhere. The silence wasn't forced, it was learned. Out on the track, the formation had gathered again. Young men and women in neat lines, adjusting their laces, awaiting instruction. A training NCO barked roll call, but eyes kept drifting toward the colonel and the woman walking beside him. Ford stepped forward first. "Sergeant Collins will be leading today's run," he announced, voice carrying across the open air. "She is cleared for full participation in her current uniform, effective immediately." The NCO snapped a salute. "Yes, sir." Then Ford turned toward the assembled staff, recruits, and junior officers. "New policy as of this morning," he said, tone calm but clear. "Retired service members supporting official training events will be permitted to wear appropriate uniform elements. Final discretion lies with the base commander." He let that sink in. A few brows lifted. A few heads nodded slowly. No one argued. Just off to the side, Lieutenant Harwood had reappeared, shoulders rigid, face tight with something that resembled regret. He stepped forward slightly, voice lower than before. "Sergeant Collins, I owe you an apology. I didn't recognize." Maggie raised one hand, a simple, small gesture. Not harsh, but final. "You didn't ask," she said, and then turned back to the track. The formation shifted slightly as she approached, parting just enough to let her through. She dropped her duffel beside the bleachers, stretched once, and then fell into pace at the front of the line. The cadence call began, boots moved, breath synchronized. Maggie didn't just keep up, she set the rhythm. By the second lap, the younger recruits were sweating harder than they expected. By the third, they weren't wondering why she was there anymore. They were wondering how to keep up. Colonel Ford stood at the edge of the track, arms crossed, watching the run unfold. Beside him, the training NCO leaned slightly and said with a grin, "Sir, you think she's gonna let him catch her?" Ford's eyes tracked Maggie's steady stride. "Only if she wants to," he said. And deep down, every soldier there understood what had just happened. She didn't need a press release. She didn't need a ceremony. She just needed one thing back, her place. And now she had it. Not because someone gave it to her, but because she had earned it. Again. Right in front of their eyes. The track felt like home. Not because it was familiar, but because discipline always feels like home to those who've lived by it. Maggie Collins stood at the front of the formation, her expression unreadable, her posture upright. Not stiff, but balanced. Her breathing was steady, her body relaxed. To the recruits lining up behind her, she didn't look like much. Just a woman in her 40s, with gray at her temples and a faded T-shirt that didn't match anyone else's. A few glanced at each other, smirking behind their eyes. Some assumed she'd drop back by the first lap, maybe even bow out early. No one said it out loud, but you could feel it in the silence between stretches. The NCO barked the start, the formation stepped off, and Maggie moved, not with fanfare, not with flash, just smooth, even strides. Her arms swung low and efficient, knees lifting just enough, heels kissing the ground like they knew exactly where they were supposed to land. At first, the younger soldiers found the pace manageable. A bit quicker than usual maybe, but nothing crazy they could keep up. That's what they told themselves. By the second quarter mile, something changed. Their breathing had picked up, but hers hadn't. She wasn't talking, wasn't showing off. She was just running, exactly the same way she would have in Kandahar, or Fort Benning, or anywhere else she'd trained over the past 2 decades. You could hear the shift before you saw it. Boot falls that had started crisp began to stagger. A few recruits shuffled mid-stride. 1 or 2 were already wiping sweat from their foreheads. Maggie hadn't even adjusted her pace. And then, slowly, the dynamic flipped. The same recruits who had glanced at her with skepticism just moments earlier were now watching her feet, trying to match the rhythm. A few fell behind, then surged back up. One tried to pass her. He didn't last a quarter lap. She didn't even look at him as she pulled ahead again, like gravity just naturally obeyed her. There was no swagger in her gait. Just certainty, just experience. By the second lap, you could hear the effort in the group. The kind of breath that comes not from sprinting, but from the panic of realizing your baseline isn't high enough. Maggie's expression never changed, eyes forward, pace unbroken. She ran like she had something to protect, and maybe she did, not herself, but what the uniform was supposed to mean. Behind her, the murmurs had faded. The recruits weren't talking anymore. They were learning, just not from a lecture. They were learning that presence doesn't come from age. It comes from pressure, from the weight someone's carried without complaining, from the way someone moves when they've long since stopped needing applause. Out on the sideline, Colonel Ford stood with his arms folded, watching the entire run unfold with quiet pride. The NCO beside him shook his head, a smile tugging at the edge of his voice. "Sir," he said, "they're not going to forget this morning." Ford didn't look away. "No, Sergeant. I imagine they won't." By the fourth lap, one of the youngest recruits, a wary kid barely 19, stumbled and caught himself. He didn't fall, but his confidence did. Maggie glanced over her shoulder once, just once, and then did something subtle. She slowed her pace half a step, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough to let him catch up. When he drew even with her, he didn't look at her face, just the way her feet moved, the way her shoulders didn't bounce, the way her breathing came in through the nose and out through the mouth, calm and practiced. And then, he matched it. By the time the group rounded their final lap, the whole formation had reshaped itself. No longer scattered, now cinched, now focused. Maggie didn't say a word as they crossed the final marker. She didn't raise her arms or collapse dramatically like some of the others did. She just stepped to the side, turned, and watched the rest come in, like any other pace runner. But they knew. Every one of them knew. She wasn't there to impress them. She was there to show them what was possible. And in doing so, she earned something more lasting than a salute or a title. She earned quiet respect, the kind that comes from doing the job when no one expects you to. The recruits stood panting, hands on hips, sweat running down their faces. A few snuck glances toward her. Their expressions changed, not cocky, not dismissive, just grateful. They didn't know everything about Maggie Collins, but they knew one thing now without question: she belonged. The track emptied slowly, one recruit at a time. Most drifted toward the mess hall or the showers, trading exhausted jokes and catching their breath after the hardest run they'd ever experienced. But Maggie Collins didn't follow them. She stayed back near the bleachers, sitting on the concrete steps with her elbows on her knees, staring out at the horizon where the desert faded into heat haze, and the sound of boots gave way to the steady thrum of a distant rotor. It was quiet now. The kind of quiet that only comes after effort has burned off the noise in your head. She reached for her canteen and took a slow sip, letting the silence settle over her like a blanket she'd known for years. That was when she heard the footsteps. Not loud, not hurried, just hesitant, like the person making them wasn't sure if they had the right to walk this far alone. She turned her head slightly and saw her. A young private, barely 20, if that. Brown hair tucked under a cap too new to have creases. Still in formation sweats, still carrying the kind of energy that hasn't yet learned how to pace itself. She clutched a water bottle like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. The girl said, almost too quiet to hear. Maggie looked up, not smiling, but not cold. Just present. "Yes." The private took a few steps closer. I saw the tattoo." Her eyes flicked nervously toward Maggie's shoulder. "That's real, isn't it? I mean, not just decorative." "That's night owl." Maggie didn't answer right away. She looked down at the ground, where sunlight cut long shadows across the pavement. A breeze stirred the grit at her feet. "It's real," she said finally. The private swallowed. "My cousin served in the guard. He told me stories about a unit that never got medals, said they were ghosts. Just rumors. Something about Northern something. Northern Gate." Maggie finished for her, her voice soft but steady. "April 2000. That's where the tattoo came from." The girl stood there, wide-eyed, unsure if she should be asking more, but unable to stop. "Was it true?" she asked. "The convoy. The standoff. Did you really hold the position alone?" Maggie's eyes didn't meet hers this time. They were on something else now, something far older than the present moment. A memory too big for words. "Not alone," she said after a pause. "Never alone." Her voice was calm, clear, but something beneath it caught a tension like a wire stretched between 2 points in time. The others didn't make it back. The private's expression changed. Something in her chest seemed to fold inward. She stepped back, embarrassed. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have asked. I didn't mean to." Maggie raised a hand gently, stopping her. "They don't need your pity," she said. "They never did." The breeze kicked up again, lifting the edge of her sleeve, brushing over the worn numbers on her back. "They needed time," Maggie continued. "Time to do what we trained for. Time to make a difference. Time to get someone else out alive." She looked up, her eyes finally meeting the young woman's. "When they ran out of time, they gave me mine." The private blinked. Her throat worked like she was trying to speak, but no words came out. She just nodded, and for a moment that was enough. But Maggie wasn't done. "You asked if it was true," she said. "It is. But here's what no one puts in the stories." She gestured to the track behind them. "It's not about being a hero. It's about being ready. When the plan falls apart. When the radio goes silent. When no one's coming and you have to decide who walks away and who stays behind." The girl listened like every word weighed more than her boots. Maggie's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "When that moment comes, private," she leaned forward slightly. "You won't have time to ask if you're enough. You'll just move, and you'll pray someone trained you the right way." The girl finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Was that why you came back? After all these years?" Maggie looked out again, toward the mountains, toward something far away that still called her in quiet moments. "I came back," she said, "because someone's got to show you what quiet strength looks like." The words landed gently, firmly. Not the loud kind. Not the kind that shouts orders or shows off on social media. The kind that keeps going when there's no one to see it. The kind that carries the weight, even when it shouldn't have to. The private stood straighter now. Something inside her had shifted. The doubt hadn't vanished. But the fear had somewhere to go now, to be reshaped into purpose. Maggie picked up her duffel, slung it over her shoulder. She glanced at the girl one last time. "You'll face things they won't prepare you for," she said. "You'll lose friends. You'll question orders. You'll make calls that stay with you forever." Then she paused, and with a voice calm as the New Mexico wind, "But when the noise fades, be the one still standing." And with that she walked toward her truck, boots crunching softly on gravel. Leaving behind more than footprints, she left a lesson. One the private wouldn't forget, not ever. The sun had risen high over Camp Greystone by the time Maggie Collins reached the far edge of the motor pool. Her boots made soft sounds on the gravel, and the heat shimmered off the asphalt like a veil of memory. The place looked the same as it had years ago. Rows of Humvees, the faint scent of oil and hot metal, mechanics in grease, streaked uniforms moving with that quiet coordination only soldiers understand. She found a spot in the shade of a maintenance shed and leaned against the concrete wall, her duffel resting beside her. From here, she could see the track in the distance, the same recruits she'd just run with now moving in smaller clusters, catching their breath, laughing quietly, looking more like a unit than they had that morning. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the wind press against her skin. That was when the question came, soft, uncertain, but honest. "Mem." She opened her eyes. It was the same young private, still holding that water bottle like a tether, her face flushed not from the run, but from something deeper, from something she didn't quite know how to ask. "If you don't mind," the girl said gently, I still don't understand something." Maggie nodded once. "Go ahead." The private hesitated. Then, "Why'd you come back, after everything? After they forgot your name, buried your records, treated you like a stranger the moment you stepped through the gate? Why come back?" Maggie didn't answer right away. She looked out again, past the buildings, past the vehicles, toward the desert beyond, where the land stretched wide and silent and unchanging. Then she spoke, not quickly, not with bitterness, just truth. "I came back," she said, "because someone has to show you what strength really looks like." The private's brow furrowed gently, confused. "Not the kind that barks orders," Maggie continued. "Not the kind that posts selfies in uniform or recites regulation like scripture. I'm talking about quiet strength." She turned to look the girl in the eye. The kind that doesn't need a ribbon or a ceremony to know its worth. The wind kicked up a little dust at their feet. You know what the hardest part of war is? Maggie asked. It's not the gunfire. Not the exhaustion. Not even the loss. The girl didn't answer, just shook her head slightly. It's what they take from you afterward, Maggie said, piece by piece. Not all at once. First they forget your name, then your unit, then the mission. She paused. And then they make you feel like it never happened. The girl looked down, suddenly unsure. But Maggie's voice softened. I don't say that so you feel sorry. I say it so you understand what comes next. Because there will be days, after deployments, after long nights, after everything you've given, when you'll wonder if any of it mattered. She crouched slightly, picked up a handful of sand, let it run through her fingers. But here's the truth they don't print in the manuals. You don't serve for recognition. You serve for the ones next to you. For the ones who can't come back. For the mission that nobody will ever know about, but still had to be done. The girl's grip tightened on her water bottle. Maggie stood again, brushing dust from her hands with the same careful movements she'd used to clear a rifle or write a final report. They took a lot from me, she said, voice even. Took my name off the record. Took my story off the books. But they didn't take my purpose. The girl blinked. What is it? To be the reminder, Maggie said. To be the living proof that it matters. That the weight is real. And that even if no one ever says thank you, it was still worth carrying. She slung the duffel over her shoulder, the old straps fitting as naturally as they ever had. Someone once stayed behind so I could live, she added. They didn't do it for a medal. They did it so I could stand here today and tell you why it's worth it. The girl didn't speak. She just stood there, her face shifting. Respect, awe, something more than admiration. Maggie turned toward the lot where her old Ford Ranger waited. The truck looked a little smaller than it had that morning, but maybe it was just the weight she'd set down without noticing. She opened the door, climbed in, and started the engine. The hum was steady, familiar. As she pulled away from the motor pool, she glanced once in the rearview mirror. The private was still standing there, saluting, and though Maggie didn't return the gesture, she felt it in her bones, an inheritance passed, not in words, but in silence. Down the gravel road, past the barracks, beyond the edge of base housing, Maggie disappeared into the wide open west. She wasn't leaving anything behind. She was just carrying it forward. The gravel road leading out of Camp Greystone stretched long and silent beneath the mid-morning sun. Dust lifted behind Maggie Collins' old Ford Ranger as it rolled past the last checkpoint. No guards stopped her this time, no questions asked. She didn't glance in the rearview mirror, not because she didn't care, but because she no longer needed to. For the first time in years, she wasn't walking away misunderstood. This time they knew. She passed the motor pool, the training field, the far perimeter fencing where the wind bent the flag just enough to let it snap once in the air. The base behind her went on with its routines. Trucks rumbled. Voices called cadence. Somewhere a drill sergeant was reminding a young recruit why socks mattered more than ego. But something was different. It was in the way people stood just a little taller, in the way the younger soldiers moved with a new kind of focus, in the way nobody laughed when they said her name. Inside the admin building, Lieutenant Harwood sat at his desk, staring blankly at the screen in front of him. A cup of coffee had gone cold beside him untouched. He hadn't spoken much since the run, not because of reprimands. There hadn't been any loud ones, but because of something far heavier perspective. He'd seen it in the eyes of Colonel Ford. He'd felt it when she passed him in the hallway with a nod. Not cold, not cruel, just firm. As if she knew exactly what he'd learned, and forgave him anyway. Behind closed doors, policies were quietly updated, forms were signed with fewer questions, and somewhere deep in the secure files, one folder that hadn't been touched in over 2 decades was quietly accessed. Detachment 1375. A name that used to be a rumor, a whisper between analysts, now had a face attached. And she wasn't a ghost anymore. Out on the track, a few of the recruits were still cooling down, stretching under the shade of the bleachers. One of them, the same young private who had stood to speak with Maggie, now led a small group through a cool-down circuit. Her voice was steady, her instructions clear. Every now and then, she glanced toward the road leading out of the base. And every time she did, her jaw tightened just a little, like she was holding on to something she wasn't ready to say out loud. The others noticed. They didn't tease. They didn't ask. But every one of them knew what she'd seen, and in quiet moments later, some would ask her again, not with curiosity, but with respect. Was that really her? Because by then, the stories would have started to circulate. The ones about the woman who wore the wrong shirt and still ran harder than any of them. The one the colonel had saluted without a second's hesitation. The one who didn't brag, didn't explain. Just showed up, ran the mission and left. Her name didn't appear on the day's official duty roster, but her impact did. She'd reminded them, without ever saying so, that you don't need to be visible to matter. That real strength isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the quiet voice that stands firm while others waver. Sometimes it's the shadow that holds the line and lets others step forward into the light. And sometimes it's the name that doesn't get printed, because it was never meant to be forgotten. At the edge of the base, the final gate opened without pause. The guard gave a nod, not robotic, not detached, a real one, the kind that says we know who you are now. Maggie nodded back, not smiling, but whole. She drove on, the desert widening around her, the sky opening up ahead in endless, unapologetic blue. The wind slid through the cracked window, carrying dust and memory with it. She didn't need to stay. Her job here was done. But what she left behind, that would remain. In whispered conversations at the mess hall, in quiet glances between recruits who now ran harder, in the policies updated without press release to make space for people like her, and in the silence that followed whenever someone muttered the words, Detachment 1375. Because from now on, it wouldn't be a rumor. It wouldn't be just numbers and redacted ink. It would be a name remembered with reverence. And a woman, still running, still steady, who proved that strength doesn't need a parade, just a reason, and a place to serve. One more mission, one more mile. And this time she didn't walk alone. There are moments in life when the applause never comes. No medals, no headlines, no ceremony. Just you doing the right thing, because it needs to be done. Margaret Collins didn't return to Camp Greystone to reclaim glory. She came back to show a generation what quiet strength looks like. Not the kind that shouts. Not the kind that posts selfies in uniform, but the kind that shows up when no one's watching. That's the kind of strength we often overlook in life. The single mom working 2 jobs to keep her family together. The veteran who still carries the weight of the war but says nothing. The neighbor who mows a lawn that isn't theirs just because it needs care. We live in a world that often rewards noise, but Maggie's story reminds us that dignity lives in silence. That true service doesn't ask for recognition. It just keeps showing up, one steady step at a time. And maybe, just maybe, it's the quiet ones who've been holding everything up all along. To everyone who has ever done the right thing without being noticed, this one's for you. If Maggie's story reminded you of someone in your life, a mentor, a grandparent, a fellow soldier, share their name in the comments. Tell us how they showed quiet strength. And if you believe these stories matter, stories that don't make the news but change lives, tap that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and leave a comment below. We read every single one. Let's make sure the world remembers the ones who were never supposed to be forgotten.